Thanks, guys. So, a couple of notes. Everybody I see got attracted by the toilets in the kitchen. We're going to talk mainly about iOS best practices with a nod towards Android best practices. And if you have questions about JavaScript type environments, you can ask me, but I'm not really going to talk that much about them. Okay. So this is mainly going to be about, it's from an architectural point of view, and we're going to talk about organizing projects, and as you can see, we're going to talk about other best practices. So.
Can you hold the mic a little closer just to the recording?
Okay. All right. So you've heard the first line, and you can ask yourself, what about putting dining rooms on the second floor? You could also ask yourself, what about storage in the living room? What happens when that starts to happen? What about when your hallways are too narrow? So, what's wrong with this? Okay, it doesn't feel very good. Mainly because it's inconvenient. So, oh, I got to put on, sorry. Okay, so let's talk about the goals of good architecture and liken it to the idea of what happens with buildings first. Okay, with buildings, when we think of architecture, normally with buildings we think of the artistic point of view because that's what we see. But there's other aspects that are really important, in particular how they're used, and you already got a bit of a notion on that because you felt how it felt to be in a badly architected place all of a sudden, or a badly planned place or designed. The other one is the upkeep, the cost of ownership. So how do those things relate to software architecture? Oh, before I even go on, I wanted to mention that while I was researching all this, I was looking up for some definitions, and I noticed that the main synonym for architecture is design, it turns out. And the main antonym for architecture is disorganization. Very interesting. So, what are some of the goals of good architecture? Well, we can say that elegance, a really great solution that people actually stand up and go, that's amazing. And we have a sense for that. As a software person, you have a sense for a good solution. Possibly a good structure, a number of really nice classes put together with less cohesion and all that good stuff. But for me, that's really important to me, but also first and foremost, before we even go there, we're mostly interested in how well we can understand the programs that we create. And also, in turn, how changeable they are. I'm defining this now, but we can disagree or not in a minute. I'm defining good architecture. I'm defining it this way, that it focuses on the needs of the people that will live with the artifacts of the development. In other words, you're trying to build, okay, so notwithstanding building a beautiful mobile app for other people to use, the people that never see the insides, all they see is the artistry, but it's actually not our artistry as developers. It's the artistry of the designers that designed the app, from a visual point of view. But internally, we have to live with that, and all of our peers and the people who follow us have to live with what we're building. So that's what we're talking about in architecture. And the artifacts of our development is all the code that we write. So at the end of the day, leave the best artifacts for everyone else. So let's focus for a minute on what are the needs of developers. And I kind of already alluded to that. We want the code to be understandable. The best way to make code understandable is to make it self-documenting, in my opinion. And to make it changeable, it needs to be well structured. And actually, I'm not sure if I even put this in my notes yet, but I always think about how what the effect or forces are on software and relating them to buildings. So with buildings, the forces against them are weather, things that you have to maintain like water systems. There's all these forces on the buildings which cause it to decay over time. With software, the forces against it are change. Change is the only thing that can break your software, and it always will. So, when it comes to design, we got to think about people first. And in particular, think about the needs of the next developer, because it's probably going to be you. What I'm finding in projects these days, especially with agile situations, that software is changing so fast. People are changing their decisions. They see the software. I'm talking about the people who own your software. They change their minds so often that maintenance starts happening within 3 to 4 weeks of a project start. So, and the software starts to become quite untenable in a very short time. So paying attention to your design is really important, even for yourself. So I've said before that project structures should be self-documenting. Software in itself. In particular, I'm going to focus for a minute on project structure. So I'm going to bring out the idea that, just like a website, the structure has to be self-evident. If you think about going through a website, if you can't find where things are, you just get frustrated. So we have something called information architecture, which people focus on in order to organize a website. So I'd kind of like you to think of the project structure in the same way. So I'm saying that a project structure should reflect the information architecture of the project. So first we have to organize ourselves. And we organize ourselves in groups. I've got a bit of blue text here I can't read. Okay. So I'm thinking that the easiest way to organize a project is to split all of your classes and files, and not just classes, but your assets as well, into groups to reflect the hierarchy of the stories, the data, and the mechanisms of the project. Is anybody Kleenex? No, Kleenex. I keep sniffling. So the key is to split things into hierarchies. And the biggest thing is to do it again. So you can't have too many subdivisions, because the more you subdivide it, the easier it becomes to categorize. So the importance of project organization, it depends on the size of your project. For small projects, it's not so important. If you're doing a POC, it's not so important to organize your project. It's pretty easy to find your way around. But for large projects, it becomes very important. Small projects are obvious. Big ones are not. So I'd like you to take a look at this for a minute. I've got this project structure. I called it a random project structure. But it's sort of almost random. Thank you. Because it kind of looks like somebody actually thought about this. Things are organized. There's in iOS here we have storyboards and view controllers and views and assets and cells, and they're kind of organized. They're organized into things. Same thing with Java. with Android. Someone decided it was a good idea to throw the activities all in one directory, throw the fragments in another, the models in another. Then you've got your assets, and then your resources. And again, in the layouts, we've all seen in Android, if you're an Android person, things are organized in the layout section by fragments, activities, and rows. Well, kind of looks organized, but it's more like a warehouse. It's kind of like there's parts that you have to go in order to organize it into something in the domain that you're working. You've got to figure out where all the parts are. And I've even seen situations where you end up jumping around within directories, and it actually drives people crazy. They get very upset. As a matter of fact, Android Studio will suggest by default to actually organize this way. And anybody who's using Android, it behooves me to tell you not to do it this way. We'll talk about how to do it later. Okay, so how do we start with our organization? If we look, I'm sure, is everyone in the room familiar with the MVC organization concept? Okay, so if we start with that, and we have our models, our views, and our controllers, does anyone want me to explain this before I go on? Okay, so we start there. Since almost everybody knows that, and on every requirement for a job, they seem to want that, we should all know it. So I'm going to start with the idea that the stories, in this case, and it doesn't matter whether we're on iOS, where we use the word stories a lot, or whether we're on Android, or whether we're doing JavaScript or whatever, think more in terms of an advertising story, which is how Apple got the name for Storyboards. Think of the fact that if we organize stories into view controllers and views, we're partway there. The other side of the coin, of course, is to separate the stories from other services and the models, which happen to be our data, and hopefully even more than that, the business logic. So if we separate those two out, we're really far ahead into organizing our projects. Right. So if we talk Android for a minute, we can talk about organizing things into fragments and activities and views that go with them. And other things, like in Android, we also have adapters. They should also be organized into the story hierarchy. So basically where I'm going is that everything that makes up a story should be in the story hierarchy. Everything that is a mechanism outside of the business domain should go elsewhere. We'll go further with that. Okay. So one thing I wanted to talk about for a minute is the idea of, actually, Apple brought this statement out in their documentation. They basically say, always write at the highest level of abstraction. So what that means, I'll actually look at some definitions that I picked up, that if something is abstracted, it basically is more general and less detailed, if you like. Lower levels of abstraction are at the detail level. So we really want to use, let's say we're in Apple land for a minute, you would use, instead of going to the database, you'd use core data. Instead of using base graphics, you would use core graphics. There's many levels in iOS, and we should always try to write at the highest level of abstraction first. The reason I'm talking about writing at the highest level of abstraction is that I'm interested in the absolute highest level of abstraction, which is a picture, okay? Because if you can see it, you don't have to wonder what you're looking at, okay? So that brings out the next point. That graphics as documentation has always been one of our biggest tools, and we usually do our graphics on paper or in another system. Well, in the case of Apple, we now have Interface Builder, and we can now describe our whole system as a storyboard. In Android, it's not quite there, but we still have a graphical editor, and we should be using it. Most people in Android it's actually easier to write in XML of all things, but then at least we can look at what we've wrought in pictures after the fact. And actually, you should even try to make that graphical view happen. Sometimes it doesn't come out right for some reason, so you should always try to make it happen because it's documentative purpose. For the purpose of documentation, it's important. So, although I'm going to push the iOS point of view, and I'm going to talk a lot about storyboards, but the resultant structure that we end up with for iOS, I believe, should actually be used almost identically for Android. And we'll see how that works in a minute.
Lyle,
Yeah.
just have a question if you don't mind.
Sure.
Regarding the graphics with this documentation, you mentioned self-documenting code. You mentioned using the storyboards and the interface builder for documentation. When I've done that in the past, I've had trouble searching for information in those graphics because you can't,
Example?
Control F doesn't really do much on a graphic. But any suggestions there?
When you're saying you're searching for a class name and its usage kind of thing?
Yeah, like I'm searching for something, and maybe it's what does this button do when I click on it, right? And that is buried in a link in Interface Builder, for example. Searching for that doesn't really yield many results.
That's true. I'm just wondering how you're thinking of searching for it.
Control F.
Got that part. But when you say Control F, like what are you saying? What does this button do? I'm trying to understand. For me, if I'm looking for what a button does, I go to the button, I click on the properties panel on the side, and I see what it's linked to, and then you can actually go to that, and then it will show you.
Okay, so let's inverse it then.
Okay.
So I know that there's a function called do something when a button is clicked. Right?
Okay.
And maybe it's called from 10 different buttons.
Okay.
How do I find a list of all those buttons?
Well, that's the interesting part. Sorry, did you want to answer that?
I was going to give a suggestion. Use accessibility. If you've made the app, enabled it for accessibility, and you tag the buttons and visual interface elements with descriptive enough text, when you're searching for it in the natural language search, it'll bring back the functionality of that visual element, and that will show up in your list of search
That's a
results.
search as a user of the application.
No, as a developer.
So I'll take that. That's not a problem. But that does require some effort to actually set it up. But you can actually search for usages, and they'll show up from the storyboards. As a matter of fact, they show up so well that they're in my way all the time. So, and actually part of what I'm going to be talking about, the hierarchy, I can actually show you how the hierarchy makes it easier to search, so you're not getting hits from all over the project. So, but truly, if you do a global search for, actually, if you just select find, what's it called? Find this element. I can't remember. It's not text. It's the other one. Symbol. Thank you. If you do search for symbol, they'll show up the stuff that's in the storyboard. So that's even simpler. But I like your idea as well. So, okay. So basically I'm showing that pictures show structure better than code, and we can all relate to that because we've been drawing pictures forever but not being able to automate them. Okay, so I've already said it. Use Xcode IB storyboards, and I don't really have to say anything about Android because you get it for free. If you work in XML, you end up getting a graphic. But I want to push home the point that you should be using storyboards for everything, okay? The only things really, well, I'll talk more about covering that in a minute. But the reason I want you to use storyboards is that it becomes your entry point into the app. If you label things appropriately, like they do, they call the main storyboard main, and us programmers all look for main to find our starting point. If you put everything in a storyboard, it should be your easiest way to understand the app. It should get you in there quick. So I'm promoting the documented qualities of storyboards and graphics in general. There are issues, we'll get into those in a minute. And the next one is, I would also like to stress that you should put the whole layout in your interface builder, or the whole layout into XML files. So if there's a way to express something, a property or a connection or anything, in particular with interface builder, you have layout constraints. You should be doing your constraining in Storyboard. You should not be using frames and bounds checking anymore, at least setting. There are some cases where you do need to do it, but in general, everything that you can possibly do in IB or possibly do in Android Studio's layout files, that's where it should go. The main reason is because that's the first place we look, right? Like if I want to change something, I'm going to go to those files first. Maybe this is my habit, but if my whole team knows that that's our mode of operation, then we're going to work that way. And it's really painful when you're trying to fix something and it turns out that someone has set something in code that could have been set in the storyboard or in the Android Studio file. So that's sort of where I'm going with that. Okay, so let's look at some guidelines for using storyboards, because there are some issues. The first thing is to put all controllers and views in a storyboard. Everything. So don't even use zibs at all. Okay, a lot of people might say, well, why not? Well, I'll answer that in a minute, but it's unless you can specify it otherwise. So does everybody know what a zib is? Okay, probably not. A zib is basically a view. It's a definition of a view that is self-contained, okay? And the reason I'm saying not to use it is that I'd like to reserve them for a special purpose, and that is for reusable situations, or situations where storyboards don't cover the functionality you want, sometimes in headers for tables, and various unusual circumstances. Storyboards allow you to define different kinds of cells or rows in a table very easily without going off to zibs. So you can actually see everything in one place. It's that documentation. It also helps, there's cases where you will define a zib and then you will need to create a class that's a view in order to get that zib working inside your system. And sometimes that leads to adding properties to that class and then even functionality that shouldn't even be there. I've seen a lot of projects where people put a lot of functionality inside of a view file that wouldn't even exist if you were just working with storyboards. And the other thing is that it promotes you to put all of your functionality into the controller where it belongs. Of course, unless it's actually view functionality specific. So I'm really trying to promote the use of storyboards, as you may have noticed. Okay, so the one case where we use zibs is when we want to reuse views. So if we have the same layout, if you like, it's usually a case of a layout. We would like to reuse those, and it might be in two different scenes. So we'd like to reuse that functionality, so we can with a zib. There's another case for reuse, which is a special custom control, but it's the same situation. You end up, it's for reuse. And really, that's the only place that you need to use zibs. You'll find that your footprint goes down, your understandability goes up, so why not? Okay, another interesting thing is in Android, Android has a really interesting way to reuse views through an include, which leads to a really easy way to do composition. And it's interesting in the Android world, there's a lot of reuse going on, and I find that people don't create these funny view classes that have been extended from a view because they don't need to. Because in order to include, sorry, let me make something clear for those who don't get it. When you use a zib, you've got to create a class to load that thing. That's part of the problem. When you're working in Android and you're using view include mechanisms, you never have to create a class, so this isn't a problem because it doesn't happen unless somebody really wants to do it. Okay. So the other thing I'm trying to tell you is that when you are using a graphical layout, whether it be a zib in the right case or controllers with views in them in storyboards, don't take part of the view and do it in code. Because if you do that, you're going to surprise somebody. And I guess it's all about surprise. That's the problem. When you start surprising other developers, you make them nuts, and they get upset. It's like they look for it for an hour, and all of a sudden it appears in front of their face, and they could have dealt with it directly because they would have seen it. I guess the only exception for that might be putting up a spinner, something like that. Okay. The other thing is, actually I've already said this, no, I guess I haven't, is maybe to set all your properties by IB. I think I've said this, and set all your properties in the Android files. And I just said that, so we're done. Okay.
Lyle,
Yes.
quick question, but I mean, just to clarify that, once
Sure.
you set all your properties in IB,
Mm-hmm.
that would be your default properties, like for that object, for that visible element?
Well, they wouldn't be the defaults because the defaults are already there. You're actually changing the settings in Storyboard.
Okay, but I mean,
So you're creating a view. You want it to be transparent. You want it to be a certain color, certain font, all those normal things that we do all the time.
right, but let's say I had let's say I had user properties that were applied there, then obviously they would be set to code, right?
Yeah, you mean things you're collecting from the user interface?
No, like let's say the user gets to pick a color, right?
Yeah, that's a whole different story.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm just
Yeah.
clarifying your point. It's
Yeah.
always set
Anything static.
in IB, anything static.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, good. All right. So let's talk about some of the issues. Okay? So large projects. Excuse me, I think I'm getting a cold. Large projects can be defined by large teams or a non-trivial number of scenes in a project. You can end up with a large project because your team is so large, even though you have a small amount of scenes, you still end up with a large project. So when that happens, let's go back for a second. So a lot of people say storyboards, they make me crazy. If people are working together and they're using a system like Git for source code control, and people start updating storyboards amongst each other without talking to each other, they end up going over each other's work. They end up treading on other people's work. Storyboards are really hard to work with with lots of people. So I'm going to offer some recommendations around that. The first thing that a lot of people do with storyboards, they follow Apple's advice, put everything in a storyboard, and they end up. Let's say you have a project that has 40 scenes. A scene, for those that aren't familiar, is simply a frame on the phone. I've seen projects where there's 50 scenes in one storyboard. In order to see the whole thing, you got to put it on 10% and you can't see a thing. And then what happens is people start getting upset, so they start. One solution I saw was that actually put everything in a nib and then just have the frames in the storyboard. I see someone laughing. Have you seen this before? Okay. So that's kind of a problem because it kind of renders the storyboards useless and ruins the documentative quality of it. So the first thing I would talk about that I would suggest is to split the storyboards into one per story. So if a story is a sequence of scenes, start by putting those scenes in one storyboard, have one storyboard for your main menu, and again, try and put everything that has to do with those controllers in the main menu into that first storyboard. And now it's actually been made even easier because in iOS, we can now link to other stories, which is a great piece of documentation. So we no longer have to put everything in one storyboard. And even if you're working on passcode where the linkage isn't available, actually I can't even remember. Does anybody know if you can use the linkage, the view controller link on previous versions of code? Anybody? Anybody tried it? No?
I think 8.4 is
As far back as it goes? Yeah. Okay, so even if you don't have that automatic quality, you can still link to another storyboard and then start that up in code. It's 2 lines of code, it's nothing. It's very obvious what you're doing. So split them into one per story. The other thing that you can do is make it so that one developer owns a storyboard at a time. And in smaller shops, this should be possible. Okay, in larger shops like banks, where I spend most of my time, and everybody is in on working on every piece of code at everybody's working at once on the same thing. It's hard to control, but still, you should be able to say it kind of has to be locked out. In the worst case, when you're trying to get work done and you've got a lot of people, but this is where things start to break down, when you have too many people working on the same code at the same time, you actually start to get less return. We kind of know what that's all about. You can optionally split the storyboard into one storyboard per scene, which you might think is kind of like a nib, but it's not quite the same because, again, you can link those controllers so you can trace them through the storyboards, which is a piece of functionality that a nib doesn't have. But I would actually not do this because, again, you ruin the documentative properties or qualities. And actually, I do have a suggestion, because what you can do is, let's say you have to fix one scene. You've got the storyboard, and somebody else has to go fix another scene. What I would recommend, if you have to change the storyboard because you want to move something around and there's a bug in a position or something, who knows, you can actually organize yourself to do something I call a shunt, which is, if you're familiar, and this is getting into the details, in a prepare for segue, where you come in and you have to determine which segue you're going to, that you're about to do, you can separate that into methods, and each one of those methods can be called without doing a segue. So you can actually call them directly. So if you copy the story out of the storyboard, put it into another storyboard temporarily, create the shunt, just call that code, make it happen, let it go, call it, and then call back to the other storyboard. You can actually do your work without affecting anyone else. And then when you get a time that you can now reintegrate the story into the previous story, you just copy that scene into the previous storyboard and get rid of the shunt, and you're done. It's very simple.
Is there a tutorial that shows how to do this that you can refer to?
No, I just invented it. Actually, yeah, I didn't just do it, but I've been doing it for a while. Maybe I'll write a tutorial. Okay.
You call it a shunt.
I call it a shunt because you're literally like a train. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so next, let's talk about bad organization. Okay, so here I have something, this is actually pretty simple. This is a pretty typical project. Just wanted to show you the top level. And we're going to deal with this thing called accounts and the account storyboard. So you open up accounts, and this is what you see. Why you see M's and H's here, I have no idea. Oh, because it's actually, you can't see it, but there's an icon. Okay, so you're faced with this. You look at it, and you go, okay, where do I start? Who's doing what? Okay? So I want you to imprint on this for a minute and think about, what is this? You can get an idea. There's view controllers. There's cells. They must be related. related to the view controllers. Whoever did this actually did some of the right things. They talked about what kind of types they were, so you get an indication of what the parts are and how they behave. But you really don't know how they're related. You don't know which cells go with which table. You don't know which tables go with which view controllers, et cetera, et cetera.
Lyle, quick question here, just on when it comes to organizational hierarchy. Which school of thought would you ascribe yourself to? Would you put, say, for a custom table, you sell the NIM file with the header and the main file, the implementation file, or would you keep the NIM file, all NIM files together in one folder?
That's an awesome question. Well, given what I've said already, and what I said was the situation that I called randomly organized, maybe, that would be more like that. So where I'm heading is the point where we're organizing all the parts of the same domain together, not the same type. Okay? So that, and you'll see. So you'll see that in a minute.
So header implementation knit together.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah, you'll see where we're going.
Nice.
And we're going to reorganize this, and you'll see in a minute. Okay. I thought I'd throw some Android in here as well. Every Android guy can relate to this mess. Okay, where things are literally, this is part of the answer to what you just asked, where everything's organized by what it is. Again, it's that warehouse effect, okay, where everything's in its department, but you can't, it's like build it yourself kind of thing. It's like going to Home Depot and trying to find something. Okay, so as you may have thought, okay, so good communication good documentation communicates intent. The reason is, or part of the reason, is that it eliminates or reduces surprise. Surprising developers is painful. You're making their lives full of pain. I would be too. So I'm suggesting that we show that objects are related by grouping them together according to their function. There's two ways to group things. We already saw one of them, and that was more by their type or their mechanism or even their inheritance, you might want to call it. So I'm going to talk for a minute about naming of classes so we can start organizing. So what I'd like to see happen in most projects is that we express their domain context followed by their base type. A lot of us are used to using the base type, so if we inherit something from a view controller, the words view controller are on the end of it. If we inherit from a view, the word name view is on the end of it, unless it becomes more, it's funny, the word abstract, because it's used in two ways. The less abstract we get, I hate using this, the more concrete we get, I'll use that word. The more concrete we get, say we go to a label, it happens to be inherited from a view, but we don't call it a view because it actually is a label. We've made something out of that. So it's become more concrete. So we're used to doing that, but I've seen situations where people leave that off and it gets really confusing because people tend to use variables without types, and sometimes the types, I've seen situations where the only difference between one variable and another is they contract part of the name. They remove the vowels. They're the same name, two different things. I've seen all kinds of trickery. So the domain context is all about the responsibility of the class. What is it supposed to do? Responsibility is a big word. And actually, if I said there was the most important thing you could ever think about in OO is the responsibility of a class. Okay, base types I just talked about, but it really is about its heritage, where it comes from. Gives you an indication as to how it behaves without actually knowing the domain. And the domain tells you how it behaves in the context of all the parts. Okay. Right, I did use the word concrete. So here's a concrete example of the way to name something. It's an account detail, that's the domain part of it, and the view controller is what it is, or at least how it behaves, so you know what you're dealing with. Most of us probably are somewhere around here. You might call it, and you'll see how I use the detail. The context isn't so important yet, we'll see it in a minute, but usually we put the type on the end of it. Okay. More abstract, or if it's, if it's more abstract, we might have a paging controller, but we're going to create a tab paging controller as a unit. So this is something we can use. And if we use it, we might actually use it in the context of an account detail tab paging controller. Or you might drop the tab part. You know, there's a few places where adding tabbed doesn't help once you've got the domain there, kind of thing. But can't hurt. I'm all for verbosity. I've come a long way. I used to be a C programmer. I used to remove every vowel I could find. Although I never did go to single letter variables. Okay. Okay, so the next thing is the grouping. Grouping all these things together. Very simple. Just use the domain context as per the class names. So as we make our groups, we just take the domain and we use that as our grouping. Very simple. Okay, so an implementation note is in iOS, you should create your groups as folders. There's two ways to use grouping in iOS. There's an implied grouping called groups, and then there's folder grouping where it actually creates a folder. If anybody wants to know how to do it, they can email me. It's not hard, it's just a little tricky. And then in Android, it already is available. Everything's already done. You're using package scoping. Use those. Some people are afraid to use packages in Java. I'm not really sure why. They're not that special. Use them. They're just folders. Yes, they have some implications about accessibility of the various components that are inside those packages, but if you stick with public and private, you're pretty good. Okay, so now I'm going to show a demonstration, not of the final result, but of a generalization of how you might structure your app. Okay, so this is the very beginning, the top level. And what I'm showing is, this is the usual stuff. Then you have your stories. This is where your common things might be, common classes. This actually ends up disappearing if you really push this to the limit, because other common appears in other places. But if you create something that is so useful that it might be common to other projects, it could end up here. Okay, so you'll see as we go along where we end up. Okay, so you've got your models, your services, which deliver your models, your categories, which is another one that's really a common thing that could end up anywhere. Categories are special to iOS. It's basically common code, but it happens to have a special, you use it in a special way. For those of you who are familiar, it doesn't really matter. Think of it as common code. Then you have your images, and we'll see where we put those in a minute. The next thing is to open up the stories and see what happens there. So we're opening it up, and we see we have our main story, which is basically our menu. We have our first story, another story I called accounts, and then within the story there's common code, and within the stories there's common views. Now don't forget, these views are common to all stories, or at least more than one. That's what's important. More than one makes it common. If it's only one, it's specific. And then you see the rest of it down here. Now I'm going to open up story 1. Oh, by the way, well, actually, this comment should be for the next piece. Just a minute. Okay, so I've opened up main. It's really simple. It's got a view controller and a menu view and nothing major there. I've decided that you'll see cases where I might group these, but in the case where there's only an M file and H file, you don't really need another folder. although you could. And then I have story one, in which you see the storyboard, the intro, a master. So the intro you could think of as how to use this app kind of thing. A detail screen one, a detail two, and then there's a comment in your views you saw before. And again, here we're opening views on the outer level of stories. It's hard to see what this is. This is stories views. And what we have here is some common things. The call to action button that you're using for your whole system, your secondary call to action button, your cancel button. These are things you use over and over and over again. So they're used throughout all stories in the project, but they're not common. Actually, no views will be common to the whole thing. Well, actually, maybe they will. Maybe it turns out this circular gauge view might be useful elsewhere. So that could end up in the views outside stories, which would be interesting. So it's almost like once you're finished your project, if everything's set in the right place, you could actually cherry pick all your reusable stuff because it would bubble to the top, which is kind of neat. Okay. And I had a comment. Oh, yes. So the other thing, and this goes towards searching, what I've found by structuring this is that if I'm looking for a symbol, this goes towards your question. I don't know your name. The guy, oh, he's not here. Okay. Towards that earlier question about searching, you'll find, this is probably true of Studio, I can't remember right now, but in Xcode, you can actually set your scope, and you can set it by your hierarchy. So if you're looking for a symbol that might be used all over the place because it's such a common name, you can actually set your scope by the hierarchy, which makes it really convenient. And if you put your storyboard in the hierarchy, sometimes I see people starting to do this, but they leave all their storyboards outside the hierarchy, then that gets left out, which is too bad. Okay, so next level. Yes, so here's story one open. Just a second, I'm just, yeah. Okay, so story one open. Okay, so we have this main storyboard. By the way, this has been internationalized. That's why it's got a pointer there, so it actually leads to some storyboards that are subsets of that. But the story one storyboard is under story one. And that includes all scenes that would be in story one, except for any scenes that have been pulled out for whatever reason. Okay? So that's your access to story one. In the intro, I've actually thrown in an XC assets file. So what this ends up being is all graphics for the intro. So instead of putting them all in one place, because they're very specific to the story, put them right where they need to be, in front of the developer's eyes. Okay, and so here you have your other things. There's actually an action button for story one intro by itself, the view controller for it. So these are all the parts for that view controller. Then you have your master, same deal, except in here you've got a table view controller. Notice the names, so that if you're ever looking at it in a source code control system, you can tell what it is, or if it's out of context for some reason. Or if you're looking for something and somebody named it, you can actually end up with the same names by accident sometimes. And here's a cell for that view controller. Okay, so it keeps going. You get the idea. It's not too hard once you see it open. Here's a special button. This answers your question specifically. Who asked the question about where you put your zibs and your H files? I think I lost them already. Okay, so here we have everything that makes up that button in this directory. Same thing with story one's header view, which is part of story one's. It's a header view, I guess in this case because it's in the views section and it's not part of one of these stories. It's probably a header for all of story one. That makes sense. Okay. And then, of course, your common views. Here's your models. In this case, I've thrown in a core data model. and here's some of the models within it. Notice I've named the model. That's kind of important. I think the word model is very useful because everything should have a type, and when it's just data, it's a model, or if it's business rules. Web services are here, categories are here. Now, let's look at the same example that we looked at before. Okay, these are exactly the same files as that disorganized example I showed you at the beginning. But now if you look at it, you know, I've left out some of the assets, but you can see that the storyboard's up there. You know what's in the account. The account list is here, and I didn't use the word list here because table to me means list, so that's good enough. It's kind of redundant to say list. I don't use S's because they're easy to miss, unless it's actually what somebody calls it. Like if somebody calls this thing accounts, which I did up there, then that's just a generality. So here we have all of the stuff for account detail. Here's at the higher level, this is the account detail overview. You can notice that there's a page view controller in here, which the detail view controller uses. It turns out this detail page view controller uses the overview and the transaction view controllers or scenes. And now all of the cells are sorted. We know that all these cells belong to the account detail overview, and all of these cells belong to the transactions. Right? So we can easily tell what's going on there. The other thing, total cell, table view, yeah, that's it. Okay. So you can see, if you come to a project like this, it's like, oh, I know where I'm going. Pretty well. I mean, it's still going to be a mystery until you get into it. So let's move on to the Android side of the room. Okay, so here's the same list done organized. Okay, it's not as good as, well, you can't do secondary folders in the layout section of Android, which is too bad because you really need it. We have projects, the one that I just finished working on, there might have been a couple of hundred of these. There might even be more than a couple of hundred. But so in this case, you can see what goes with what. It's actually, these are exactly the same as the previous example, but done in the Android way, or part of the Android way. You can imagine that there are fragments and or activities that relate to all of these, except for the rows. Okay, so toilets in the bathroom. Feels a little bit better. Very convenient. No surprises. Okay, other convenient designs. Dining rooms near the kitchen. That works. Storage in the basement. And the hallways are wide enough. Good architecture makes your life and your job easier. That's it. Thanks.